There comes a moment in every life, in every nation, where you are tested, not by how loudly you can agree, but by whether you have the strength to say no. Saying no is harder than saying yes. Yes can win you applause, it can win you comfort, it can make you look agreeable. But no requires backbone. No requires the courage to stand alone when the pressure is overwhelming. And that is exactly what happened when the words, "absolutely not," were spoken. They weren't just words. They were a wall, a shield, a refusal to bend under the weight of foreign demands. It was a moment that reminded the world that dignity is not for sale. Think about it. How many times in history have nations lost their identity because they didn't have the courage to resist? How many times have people compromised everything they stood for just to stay in favor with the powerful? Those two words, does, absolutely not, cut through that cycle. They said enough. They said, we will not be dictated to, we will not be used, we will not trade our sovereignty for convenience. That was not only a statement, it was a declaration of independence, as not from chains, but from control. And it takes a special kind of strength to deliver that message, because when you say no to a small person, you risk very little. But when you say no to a giant, you know the consequences will follow. You know the pressure will increase, the criticism will come, the attacks will rise. Still, the refusal was clear, and that is what made it powerful. It wasn't the size of the words, it was the size of the courage behind them. For the people listening, it struck something deep, because every citizen wants to see their leaders defend their dignity. Every person wants to believe their country stands tall, not begging, not bowing, but standing with pride. As those words became more than a political statement, they became a mirror for the people themselves. If a leader could say absolutely not, then why couldn't they say absolutely not in their own lives? Absolutely not to corruption. Absolutely not to being exploited. Absolutely not to living in fear. The ripple effect was personal as much as it was political. And that is why the phrase hit so hard. It wasn't just directed at America. It was directed at every force, every system, every person that believes power gives them the right to control others. It was a reminder that strength is not measured by how much force you can project, but by how much resistance you can withstand without breaking. That's real strength. That's real power. In that moment, the message was simple: sovereignty cannot be compromised. Integrity cannot be traded. Dignity cannot be borrowed. It must be protected. And sometimes protecting it comes down to having the courage to speak two words that everyone else is afraid to say. So remember this, whether it is in politics, in business, or in your own life, the world will pressure you, tempt you, and push you to compromise your values. But real strength comes when you look at that pressure and you have the courage to answer, absolutely not. Dignity is something no one can hand you and no one can take away unless you allow it. And when those words, absolutely not, were spoken, they carried with them the weight of national dignity. It wasn't just a political statement, it was a message to the world: we are not here to be used. We are not here to be ordered around. We are not here to play someone else's game at the cost of our own self-respect. That moment touched millions because deep inside, every person longs for respect, not only as individuals, but as a nation. When a country bows down to external pressure, it is not just the leader who looks weak. It is every citizen who feels the sting of humiliation. But when a leader stands firm, when they say no to being controlled, the people feel taller. They feel like their voice, their pride, their history is finally being honored. And that is why those two words went beyond politics. They became a symbol of dignity, a fire that reminded the people who they really are. National dignity is not built on borrowed strength. It is not earned by serving the interests of someone else. It is forged in the willingness to stand firm even when it costs you. Because dignity is expensive, it demands sacrifice, as it demands courage, and it demands that you never put your self-respect up for sale. That is why those words carried such weight. They were not a negotiation, they were a line drawn in the sand. And people everywhere understood it. The young felt inspired because they saw a future that wasn't chained to foreign control. The old felt proud because they knew the sacrifices of generations before them were not being wasted. Even critics had to acknowledge that the words cut through the noise like lightning, because dignity is something every human being can recognize instantly. But dignity doesn't only apply to nations, it applies to you and me as individuals. Just as a country must decide whether to bow or to stand, so must each of us in our own lives. Every time you compromise your principles to please someone else, you lose a little piece of dignity. Every time you trade your values for comfort, you shrink inside. But when you say, absolutely not, even in your own personal battles, you grow stronger. You reclaim a piece of yourself that no one can touch. That's why this moment mattered. Because it wasn't just about rejecting a demand from outside. It was about reclaiming pride from within. It reminded the people that their worth is not determined by how useful they are to others, but by the strength of their own identity. It was a message that self-respect must come first and everything else second. And when those words echoed, they gave a new sense of pride to an entire nation. Pride that did not depend on approval. Pride that did not beg for validation. Pride that stood on its own, because when you defend dignity, you defend everything that truly matters. Sometimes it only takes a few words to change everything. Not long speeches, not endless explanations, but short does. Sharp words that cut straight to the heart. That is what made absolutely not so powerful. It wasn't wrapped in political jargon. It wasn't softened to please anyone. It was clear, it was direct. And it became a symbol almost overnight. Those two words carried more weight than paragraphs of polite diplomacy, because symbols don't need explanation. They speak for themselves. History is full of these moments. Think about the phrases that moved entire nations. Words so simple that anyone could remember them, repeat them, and carry them in their hearts. They became more than words. They became banners, rallying cries, sparks that lit movements. That is exactly what happened here. Absolutely not. Turned into a phrase people could wear, chant, share, and hold on to as their own. It wasn't just a leader's stance. It became the people's stance. And why did it resonate so deeply? Because simplicity is truth. When you strip away all the excuses, all the explanations, all the complications, the truth stands bare and undeniable. And the truth was that compromise was not acceptable. The truth was that sovereignty had to be defended. And the truth was captured in just two words. That's why people everywhere could grab onto it. That's why it traveled faster than long speeches ever could. Symbols like this give people identity. They remind them of what they stand for, they unify them under a common message, and they make them feel part of something larger than themselves. When people shouted, absolutely not, they weren't just repeating a leader's words. They were declaring their own resistance, their own pride, their own refusal to bow down. It gave ordinary citizens the language of defiance, as the courage to express what they had felt silently for so long. And let's not forget, the world noticed too. When words this simple and this strong are spoken, they cannot be ignored. Other nations, leaders, and observers saw the statement and understood that here was a line no one was going to cross. The clarity of those words made it impossible to twist, impossible to misinterpret. They stood as a bold reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not an army or a law, but a sentence that cannot be broken. In life, we all need symbols like this. Maybe not always on the scale of nations, but in our personal lives. Does. Words that remind us who we are and what we stand for. A phrase that we can repeat to ourselves when pressure comes knocking, when fear tries to silence us, when temptation asks us to bend. A phrase that tells us this is the line I will not cross. That is why, absolutely not, will be remembered not as just a response to a question, but as a symbol of resistance, courage, and clarity. Because when words become symbols, they stop belonging to one person. They belong to everyone who chooses to carry them forward. When those words, absolutely not, were spoken, the impact didn't stop at the borders. They echoed far beyond, reaching leaders, analysts, and ordinary people around the world. It was not just a rejection of one demand. It was a challenge to a system of power that had grown used to obedience. And when someone finally stands up and refuses, it forces everyone watching to pay attention. That is why the ripple effect was so strong. Those two words sent a message that sovereignty still matters, that dignity cannot be traded, and that courage is contagious. On the world stage, power is often measured in weapons, money, or influence. But in that moment, power was measured in defiance. The refusal to bend showed that leadership is not about pleasing the powerful, it is about protecting your people. And that lesson was not lost on others, as nations struggling with similar pressures saw a reminder that they too could stand their ground. People living under doubt and fear saw proof that courage can cut through intimidation. It was more than politics, it was an example. And the beauty of examples is that they spread. They plant seeds in the minds of others who are watching silently, wondering if they too can resist. When they see someone say, absolutely not, without flinching, it whispers to them, maybe you can do the same. That is the ripple effect. Courage breeds courage, resistance sparks resistance, and dignity inspires dignity. The reaction from the powerful was predictable. Pressure increased, criticism sharpened, and attempts were made to paint the refusal as reckless. But the very intensity of the response only proved the weight of the words. If it were meaningless, no one would have reacted. The fact that the world debated, argued, and discussed it showed that it hit the center of the issue. It exposed truths that many preferred to keep hidden. And for the people, it was energizing. They felt their voice carried across oceans. They saw their struggle reflected on the global stage. For once, it wasn't about being dictated to, it was about sending a message outward. We choose dignity. And that pride was felt not just at home, but in communities abroad, where people carried the phrase as a symbol of strength. Leadership is not only about managing problems within your borders, it is about shaping how your nation is seen in the world. With those words, the image projected was not weakness, not submission, but backbone, and backbone commands respect, even from opponents. The world may not agree, but the world always notices strength. So when we think about those two words, we must understand they were not only heard, they were felt. They sent waves through the halls of power, but they also stirred hearts across continents. And that is the true mark of global impact, when a statement is too bold to ignore and too strong to silence. Absolutely not was more than a reply, it was the spark of a movement. At first, it was simply a phrase spoken with conviction. But the moment those words left the mouth, they stopped belonging to one person and started belonging to the people. They turned into a chant, a slogan, a declaration of defiance that ordinary men and women carried into the streets, onto their lips and into their hearts. What began as a political statement became a mindset, a refusal to compromise values, a refusal to bend under pressure, a refusal to trade dignity for comfort. That is the power of words when they align with the will of the people. They grow bigger than speeches, bigger than policies, bigger than politics. They become a spirit. Absolutely not became that spirit because it captured exactly what people had been feeling but could not express. It gave them language for their frustration, for their pride, for their demand to be respected. And once people find language for their feelings, there is no stopping them. Movements are never born from long, complicated ideas. They are born from clear, simple truths. And the truth here was undeniable. No more submission, no more silence, no more being told what to do without question. That was why the word spread like wildfire. In rallies, in conversations, on banners, and in songs, they echoed with a power no one could control. But the most important part of this transformation is not that it became a chant in the streets. It's that it became a principle in the minds of the people. It challenged individuals to ask themselves, what am I compromising in my own life? Where have I bowed when I should have stood tall? Where do I need to say, absolutely not? That is how a movement grows, not just through crowds, but through personal awakenings. One person at a time, deciding to live with dignity and courage. And this is where the legacy of those words truly lies. Leaders can speak, but movements only last when people carry the spirit forward themselves. When absolutely not shifted from a leader's stance to the people's stance, it crossed the boundary from politics to history. It stopped being a moment and started being a mindset. This is why even opponents could not dismiss it. They could attack the leader, they could criticize the politics, but they could not erase the words once the people had made them their own. Once dignity takes root in a nation's heart, it cannot be uprooted. It may be challenged, it may be tested, but it cannot be destroyed. So remember this, absolutely not, is not just a phrase from the past. It is a call to the present. It is a reminder that in every life, in every generation, there will come a moment to stand tall, to resist, to declare with full conviction, absolutely not.